Hello, everyone. My name is Hatel, and I'm the Community and Education Outreach Manager here at the Autism Alliance of Michigan. We want to welcome all of you to our first breakout session of the day. I'm just going to briefly give a little bit of information about the Alliance and who we are. So we are guided by the vision that people with autism lead lives that meet their greatest potential. And our mission is to lead efforts to raise expectations and expand opportunities for people touched with autism across the lifespan. We have many different programs, but the one program I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about today is our Navigator program. It is the heart of our program, and it is a free consultation program that provides families, professionals, individuals on the spectrum, information on any questions or concerns that someone might have through their autism journey. We help to identify and access families and individuals on the spectrum to appropriate services and resources throughout the state of Michigan. Please keep in mind, we are a statewide agency. So different reasons. We have our Navigator program. Like I said, it's open Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. till 6 p.m. and is housed by autism professionals, master level clinicians, and we can help answer questions ranging in a span of different areas. Just as I'm showing you on the screen here, if you need help getting your earliest diagnosis to transition planning to safety to advocacy. So as we start off with our presentations, if there's specific questions that come up, please don't hesitate to reach out to one of our navigators. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to our presenters now.
Good morning, everybody. We are really happy to be here today. We are going to be discussing a presentation titled Overcoming Social Skills Deficits, Strategies for Children with Autism Spectrum Disorder. So, there we go. Okay, so to give an introduction of ourselves, I am Nora Coultis. I am completing my doctorate in clinical psychology at Illinois Institute of Technology. I am currently the pediatric neuropsychology intern at Henry Ford Health System. And then beginning in this upcoming fall, I will be completing my fellowship in pediatric neuropsychology at Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital. So I'll let Dr. Maggie Gindlesperger introduce herself.
Thank you, Nora. Good morning, everybody. So I'm Dr. Maggie Gindlesperger. I'm a senior staff neuropsychologist at Henry Ford Health System. And I completed my internship at Helen DeVos Children's Hospital just here on the other side of the state. And my fellowship I completed down at Florida Hospital for Children. It's really wonderful to be here. We're very excited about this presentation, and we will really want to send a big thank you to Autism Alliance of Michigan for having us here to be able to talk with all of you today.
All right. So to just give a brief kind of overview of the Division of Neuropsychology at Henry Ford, we are one of the country's largest healthcare systems. We've got several hospitals and other kinds of satellite facilities that we see patients in. Within the Division of Neuropsychology, we conduct evaluations in our downtown Detroit office. We also have other locations in Clinton Township, West Bloomfield, and Dearborn. But our role in neuropsychology is really just to study how the brain structure and the brain functioning really affects areas like behavior and emotion and thinking skills. And the way that we do that is by providing neuropsychological evaluations to children, adolescents, and adults, so across the lifespan. But these evaluations really look like, pencil and paper type tasks, brain games, working with iPads, things like that. And using standardized measurements to be able to kind of figure out strengths and weaknesses. So in addition to evaluations and diagnosis, we also provide extensive recommendations and education to patients and their families to help them really better understand their conditions and other kind of challenges that may be related. Some common referrals that we get within the pediatric population are neurodevelopmental disorders. So this can really look like ADHD or other kinds of learning disorders. Of course, we see referrals for autism spectrum disorder. And then we also have a number of medical referrals. So things like genetic disorders, seizure disorders or epilepsy, as well as traumatic brain injury and concussion. All right, so we have no financial disclosures for today's presentation. And to give a brief overview of our talk today, we're going to talk about kind of typical development in social skills, as well as what social development looks like in kids with autism spectrum disorder. We'll kind of broadly talk about some social interventions that have evidence in the research. And then I will turn this over to Dr. Gindlesperger, and she'll talk more specifically about interventions related to social thinking and social behaviors and how you might be able to implement those in your own homes. We'll also talk about kind of how some changes related to the pandemic have impacted families, as well as discuss some resources and programs, certainly within the Detroit area, but also kind of more broadly within the state. You know, it's a little bit different for us giving this presentation in a virtual format. So if anybody has any questions regarding our presentation today, please feel free to type them into the chat feature, and we're going to definitely address as many questions as we can throughout the presentation. So our learning goals today are to really have a better understanding of social development. So we're going to discuss what social skills look like in typically developing kids, as well as individuals with autism. Oftentimes what we see is that parents are kind of unaware that their child's social oddities or their social challenges are really symptoms of autism. So sometimes we see that these kids aren't kind of getting the interventions that might be helpful as early as possible. So that's kind of why we're talking about kind of what they look like in typically developing kids, as well as kids with autism. We're also going to identify some strategies to improve those social skills and how you might be able to apply those interventions at home. We're also going to discuss the impacts of the pandemic and talk about additional resources for outside organizations that are geared toward families with children with autism. All right, so talking about kind of the development of social skills. Social skills are really the rules and customs that guide interactions with other people. Typically developing children tend to kind of pick up these social skills in the same way that they pick up other kinds of language skills. So often it comes pretty naturally, it comes pretty easily. They quickly are learning kind of what works and what doesn't work. And while they're going through this process, they're creating kind of an implicit social map, if you will. So how to act in certain situations with other people. And they're, constantly adding to this map over time based on their experiences. Now, these social skills do not come as easily to kids with autism, and they may have to kind of guess how to act around others. So what we're going to talk about is kind of what these typically developing skills look like. So when we think about the infancy period, so 0 to 6 months, this is when we start to see children smile, look directly at you. So starting those kinds of early engaging type behaviors. We also see kids in this age group starting to cry to get their needs met, and they really may start to kind of imitate some faces. So those smiles, maybe those kinds of grimaces, things like that. When we move on to age 6 to 12 months, this is when typically developing kids often become more aware of familiar people versus strangers. So I'm sure you've all heard of kind of that stranger danger situation where they might cry if somebody's holding them that they're less familiar with. In this age group, we see typically developing kids start to play interactive games. So this might look like peekaboo, patty cake. They might kind of seek you out for like a tickle monster type game, things like that. We're also seeing the start of some of these kinds of nonverbal communication skills. So things like waving hi or bye. All right. Moving along to the toddler period. So this is about, 18 months to about 2 years or so. Typically developing kids really begin to pretend play. So oftentimes this might look like imitating what adults are doing. So they might be mowing the lawn next to dad or mom, or hammering a nail, something like that. It could also be, oftentimes we see kids, pretending to make you some food, things like that. In this toddler period, we're also seeing that kids start becoming interested in other kids. Now, oftentimes this is kind of just playing alongside other kids rather than a more cooperative play. So we call this kind of parallel play, but still we see that interest in others being developed. Also at this time, we're seeing typically developing kids starting to use single, clear words to express what they want. Sometimes it's phrase speech, but we're really seeing kind of those single words more. In the preschool period, so age 3 to 4, this is when kids start to show and identify a wider range of emotions. This is also when they're starting to learn how to take turns with peers. So more of that kind of sharing behavior as well. And we also see these kids in preschool starting to follow simple rules in games. Now, they may want to kind of control the play, so that sharing part might be a little more challenging. But this is when we're starting to see how they can follow some rules. All right. Now, moving along to the grade school period, so kind of the beginning of grade school, age 5 to 8. Oftentimes we see typically developing kids prefer to play with same-sex peers. But socially, we see them engaging in a lot more imaginative play. So maybe they're playing house or playing school, things like that. Also, during this age range, we see that kids begin to understand what other people may be thinking or feeling. So they might have a better understanding that somebody's feelings were hurt, something like that. If we move a little bit farther along to age like 9 to 10, this is when we see typically developing kids start to really narrow their peer group and show more of an understanding of what makes a friend. So they may understand that so-and-so is a friend because we both like to play these kinds of games together. Also, this is when we start seeing kids use conflict resolution skills. So kind of those more advanced social interaction skills. All right. Now in the adolescence and kind of adulthood period, this is where these kind of more advanced skills really take off. So we see more use of conversational skills, and this is really that kind of like reciprocal back and forth conversation. Also, individuals start to find common interests and use those to kind of develop friendships and relationships. We also see a lot more improvement in these kinds of nonverbal communication techniques. So things like being able to integrate eye contact, understanding kind of the idea of somebody's personal space or boundaries. So not kind of like coming straight up and being in your face. There's also improvements with what we call like the entrances and exits of conversations. So being able to kind of enter a conversation without interrupting, or, with an appropriate greeting, things like that, as well as being able to leave a conversation. Oftentimes, kids with autism might just kind of abruptly exit and walk away or something like that. So these kinds of entrances and exits of socially appropriate conversation are seen at this time. Also, typically developing adolescents and adults have a better understanding of others' perspectives and emotions, as well as their own kind of self-regulatory skills. Now, why are these social skills important? So we know from research that strong social skills are really associated with being able to form friendships and gain peer acceptance and other kinds of social support. As you can imagine, if you feel like you've got all of these good social supports around you, these lead to or are associated with improvements in self-esteem and self-confidence, as well as kind of overall happiness and better mood. And then social skills are also related to being able to utilize effective communication skills. So if you think about academic functioning or occupational functioning, it's really important to be able to kind of successfully be able to communicate with your peers or your cohort. On the flip side, research, we know also that youth with autism tend to suffer from both direct and indirect consequences of these social challenges. So we do see that poor social skills are often associated with overt kind of peer rejection and poor social support. Oftentimes this is associated with isolation and loneliness, as well as poor self-esteem. And then poor social skills are also related to higher rates of depression and anxiety. And kind of what I mentioned on that last slide is we see individuals with more challenges in social skills tend to have more academic and occupational underachievement. Okay. All right, so when we think about social skills deficits in kind of a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, we really think of the DSM-5. The DSM-5 is the manual that clinical psychologists use to diagnose neurodevelopmental disorders like autism, as well as a host of other mental health disorders. But the DSM-5 really identifies three main areas of deficits in social communication and interaction to meet criteria for a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. Those three areas are deficits in social emotional reciprocity, deficits in nonverbal communication behaviors that are used for social interaction, and then deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. So as you can see, this impairment in social functioning is really a core feature of a diagnosis of autism. So now I just kind of gave you the jargon from our manual, but what does that actually mean? Or what does it look like in kids with autism? So to talk about those deficits in social emotional reciprocity, what this often looks like is difficulty with that back and forth or that reciprocal conversation. This may look like failure to initiate conversation or kind of respond appropriately to others' social interactions. We also see kids with autism not really understanding how others might be feeling or thinking, as well as having trouble identifying some shared interests or emotions. This can also really be bidirectional. So some children may have difficulty with that social initiation, But others are maybe highly verbal, but tend to have kind of those one-sided conversations. So it may look more like them just talking about an area of their own interests, as opposed to kind of a reciprocal conversation where I'm listening to what you're saying and going off of that as well. Now, to think about this second domain, the deficits in nonverbal communication behaviors that are used for social interaction, this can look like a few things. So certainly abnormalities in eye contact. So it could look like poor or avoidant eye contact, where they're speaking to you, but their eyes are looking in a different direction. It can also be abnormal eye contact. So sometimes kids with autism might be talking to you kind of out of the corner of their eye, as opposed to fully directing their attention to you. We also see kind of some odd body language sometimes. So oftentimes you'll have a child with autism talking to you, but their body is fully faced away from you. Other things are deficits in kind of understanding the use of gestures. So things like if I was going to try and direct your attention to something and I said, oh, look over there, a child with autism might not really understand that that means, oh, I need to follow her finger to see what she's trying to show me. Some other challenges are really related to facial expression. So things like lack of a facial expression, or maybe not being able to use an appropriate facial expression for that particular setting. So you might see a smile or a grimace, something like that, when it's not really appropriate to that conversation. All right, and now that kind of third domain, that difficulty developing and maintaining understanding relationships. So kids with autism really have difficulties making friends and keeping them over time. So oftentimes this looks like difficulties with sharing or even imaginative play. Oftentimes it looks like kind of a lack of interest in peers. Kids with autism often have trouble kind of adjusting their own behavior to specific situations. So that might be kind of difficult to kind of make that adaptation or to adapt your own behavior. Also, these kids might have greater ease in developing friendships with children that are younger than them, or individuals that are older. So oftentimes they show more difficulty with kind of same age peers, but they can kind of adapt their play to kind of a younger age group. But as you can imagine, because of these difficulties with social interactions, a lot of kids with autism may tend to choose solo activities, which can lead to a lot of feelings of loneliness, because it's really hard to kind of navigate if you don't have this, what I called an implicit social map built in. It's hard to kind of guess and choose and navigate what you're supposed to be doing in all these different situations. All right. So some other things that we see in children with autism are difficulties with social pragmatics. And this can look like a lot of things. So greetings, for example, knowing that when you kind of walk up to somebody, say, hey, how are you? Or, hey, nice to meet you, things like that, as opposed to just kind of jumping right into a conversation about an interest, let's say. So in addition to that greeting, things like turn taking and knowing when not to talk. So knowing, okay, this person is talking right now, I need to stay quiet so that they can tell me this story and then we can go from there. This perspective taking is also often a challenge, as well as understanding non-literal language. And by that, I'm really talking about things like sarcasm, metaphors, idioms, things like that. So often kids with autism really need kind of direct language in order to understand what's being communicated or what's being asked of them. So for example, I recently had a patient with social pragmatic difficulties, And he really struggled on things like self-report questionnaires. So if he was supposed to read, something and indicate his level of experience with a particular situation, oftentimes those questionnaires are phrased in kind of a first person voice. So it might say, I feel shy, and you're supposed to answer, sometimes, often, always. But if he'd read that question, he'd look at me like, oh, you feel shy, okay. But if I rephrased it and said, do you feel shy? Then he'd be able to answer it. He knew that that was a question that was directed at him, that was requiring a response. So sometimes just more of that direct language is required for kids with autism. Now, one more aspect that we see often in kids with autism are difficulties with prosody. And that can look like voice volume. So, oftentimes you can get cues from people's voice volume. Are they excited? Are they angry because their their voice volume just increased? That's a nonverbal cue, or I guess technically a verbal cue, just not directly verbal. As well as kind of changes in pitch and inflection. So typically developing individuals tend to have a natural rise and fall of their pitch and their inflection. So for example, your inflection might rise when you ask a question. So, did you hear me? That inflection is cueing to you that I'm asking a question. So oftentimes, there we go. So oftentimes, these kinds of nonverbal cues are being missed with kids with autism. All right, now I do want to mention that oftentimes it's really kind of a lack of know-how rather than lack of interest. So oftentimes kids with autism can show a lack of interest in peers. However, a lot of times with autism really want that social relationship, they want that social interaction, but they just don't really know how to do it. So it's more of a difficulty with understanding how to navigate that as opposed to just a complete lack of interest sometimes. And really, we see kids with autism often lacking these opportunities for positive peer interactions. They might put themselves in fewer situations where they would have good interactions or have an opportunity to really talk to other kids their age. All right. Now, we do see that these difficulties with socialization in kids with autism still kind of persist even when the child has kind of well-developed cognitive or thinking skills, as well as language abilities. So it's not just those kids that may be kind of lower functioning cognitively. This is throughout anybody with autism typically. And also these social difficulties don't tend to go away with development. So sometimes families might think, well, once we get through this weird, elementary or middle school period, it's going to be better. That's often what we don't see. In fact, many kids with autism really experience kind of more distress and greater social impairment over time, particularly when they get to that adolescent period. And you can, this is due to quite a few reasons. So one of them is that the social demands in adolescence become more complex. So there's more sarcasm involved. There's more jokes being told. There's more kind of colloquial speech. So being able to kind of develop that social map becomes more complicated. On top of that, a lot of kids with autism become a lot more aware of their social difficulties, especially if those cognitive or those thinking skills are well developed. They might be very aware that they're not kind of meeting the same social development milestones as other kids their age. So this can certainly lead to more distress. The good news is, and this is where we're kind of moving to next, is that we can really support a lot of these things. So we know from research that individuals with autism really benefit from direct, step-by-step teaching and modeling with a lot of opportunities for practice. So that repetition is a really important piece. We can see that clinicians and families really can use teachable moments and practice these skills in a bunch of different realistic settings so that these can kind of generalize. We can also focus on things like timing in social situations. So practicing those like entrances or those exits of conversation can be really helpful. And we can also really work on improving communication as well as those nonverbal gestures. So making sure that we're practicing how to make good eye contact or what nonverbal gestures from other people might signal. Okay, so these are all areas that we can really target. Now, when we think about what social skills interventions are appropriate for each individual, we take a few things into consideration. So the first thing is age. Of course, intervention during childhood and adolescence is really critical, but the earlier the better. However, like I mentioned at the beginning, oftentimes families don't kind of notice these social skills challenges, or they don't become more prominent until their child gets a little bit older. So it is really important to get started on these things as early as possible. Other things that we take into consideration are language abilities. And this is both receptive language, so being able to understand what other people are communicating, as well as that expressive language piece. So being able to communicate yourself effectively as well. And then we also take into consideration things like severity of those autism spectrum disorder symptoms. So oftentimes this might look like those repetitive behaviors that might be getting in the way of more kind of appropriate social interactions. All right, so I'm just going to kind of briefly talk about some techniques for social skills interventions, but afterwards, Dr. Gindlesperger is really going to kind of talk about specific interventions that might be helpful. So research in this area has really found a lot of support for interventions that are based on principles of applied behavior analysis. So research has shown us that these kinds of techniques have improved or have been shown to improve functional communication skills, as well as reduce some of those challenging behaviors. So things like aggression or those repetitive behaviors, things like that might be getting in the way of social interactions. So the first one that I want to talk about is a technique related to modeling and reinforcement. So by this, I really mean like identifying a target behavior. So these might be like maintaining eye contact or initiating a conversation or taking turns in a conversation. So identifying those target behaviors one at a time, and being able to model or demonstrate that to your child. And then letting the child practice those skills over and over while you kind of provide in vivo feedback. And then certainly we want to provide positive reinforcement afterwards so that they're more motivated to try those skills again. And reinforcement can really look like a lot of different things, and it's probably different for each child. So it could be something like a snack that they enjoy, or access to a preferred activity. One thing that I use oftentimes in the testing room is letting them have or letting them watch, their favorite 2-minute YouTube video to kind of keep up that motivation and that interest in continuing on. So pretty much the most commonly used technique of modeling and reinforcement is this social skills training. And that really uses behavioral and social learning techniques to kind of target these individual behaviors. There's also some evidence for more group-based social skills training. And the benefits of this kind of group-based intervention is that these kids with autism have more opportunities to practice their skills in a more naturalistic setting. So around other kids, in their same general age group. And just broadly, it promotes more interaction because you're just inherently around other kids, as opposed to it just being, a behavioral therapist and the child, or the parent and the child. They're able to practice these around other kids. Okay. But with this group social skills training, we have seen in the literature that there's improvement in these targeted skills, but we do know that we really have to teach these skills directly and explicitly so that we can hope that they generalize to other domains, or I guess other environments. Okay, some other social skills interventions that I want to mention briefly. One is called pivotal response training. And this is really designed to improve developmental areas rather than kind of individual behaviors. So these pivotal developmental areas that are identified are areas of motivation, initiation, and self-regulation. And by motivation, it's really referring to helping the individual kind of increase their interest in learning and practicing certain skills through positive reinforcement. So as opposed to kind of focusing on an individual behavior, really focusing more on that motivation so that they're more likely to keep practicing. Another area is this initiation piece. So being able to encourage the individual to initiate social interaction. And the way that you can do this is by kind of modeling some of these things. So getting their attention or asking questions, things like that. So targeting this kind of encouragement to initiate. And then finally, in terms of self-regulation, this is really teaching kids to kind of self-monitor behavior. And part of this is helping kids with autism kind of recognize and respond to those multiple social cues. So instead of just listening to what somebody's saying, also being able to kind of integrate those gestures or noticing other things. So, oh, this person is smiling and saying this, or this person is pointing at some things and talking to me about this, and putting those things together. Okay. Another area of potential intervention is peer-mediated supports. And this is really where you teach children to kind of model their peers appropriate social behaviors. So typically we see this intervention being implemented within a school setting. So if a child is kind of in a regular education or mainstream classroom, you might have them sit next to a peer with more kind of socially appropriate skills that have been developed so that they can watch them and model their behaviors. And then finally, I'm just going to briefly mention scripts and stories. I'm certainly going to let Dr. Gindlesperger talk more about this and kind of specific interventions related to scripts and stories here in a moment. But this is teaching certain skills like conversation or, appropriate interaction, as opposed to kind of modeling it and doing it kind of in real life. This is through stories or through scripts. So it's just another way to kind of present this information to individuals with autism.
I want to thank Nora for walking us through that first part of the presentation, where we were able to kind of take a deep dive into social skill and social skill development. Our reasoning for wanting to do that was so that for the second part of the presentation, we would really have the opportunity to kind of break down social skill development into kind of the next level of social thinking versus social behavior, and then be able to provide strategies for both social thinking and social behavior to help support those in development. So for this first part, so we're going to focus on these strategies to support this social skill development, and there are really two main concepts to consider. So we have our social thinking, which is our process of figuring out what another person might be thinking or feeling. Examples of this can be empathy, perspective taking, and then we have social behaviors, which is a set of behaviors that help us get along with others. Examples of this include things like eye contact, body language, conversational skills, and even personal space boundaries. Some of the social behaviors that this is really referencing, we discussed at the earlier part of our presentation as well, when Nora was leading us through that. Both are really important for building relationships and friendships. Next slide, please. So this is going to be kind of our guide for the second part of the presentation. We're going to focus first on the social thinking. When we really think about social thinking, social behavior, many of our evidence-based treatments are primarily focused on improving social behaviors. However, when we really take into and do an overall perspective, working on social thinking and cognition is also really important. Next slide, please. So we're going to do a little example all together, or run through a little activity. So imagine you are handed a box of M&Ms. When you open the box, you see that it is filled with buttons instead of candy. If your friend suddenly came into the room and saw the closed M&Ms box, what would he or she think was inside? If you said buttons, you may need to work on theory of mind. Most would say that the friend would think that there were M&Ms inside, since our friend does not share the same knowledge as we do, and therefore would have no reason to think that the box is filled with anything but M&Ms. Next slide, please. So the theory of mind is this understanding that people do not share the same thoughts and feelings as you do. Research really suggests that children with more advanced understanding of theory of mind tend to have more successful social relationships than their less advanced peers. So children with ASD may be unaware that others do not share their same thoughts and feelings. And typically when we think about theory of mind, it's really developing around the age of 5. However, children with autism spectrum disorder continue to struggle with this concept. Next slide. One of the ways to really support this area of theory of mind in order to help the progress with its development is that we put into words what you are both thinking and feeling when talking with your child. So for example, you put your own and your child's perspective into those words. I see that you are smiling and happy. That must mean that you like your present. Essentially what we're doing with those statements is that we're making the implicit explicit. Implicit really defines as like implied, though not plainly expressed, and explicit really stating clearly and in detail, leaving no room for confusion or doubt. Other ways of being able to help support this area is by using books to talk about the character's thoughts and feelings, and also debriefing after social situations, asking your child what the other person may have been thinking or feeling in that example or in that story. So again, what we're doing at that time is we are making the implicit explicit. Next slide, please. Another way to be able to help support this and also to help support social thinking is being a social detective. This is a really interesting concept and is really sometimes geared for like elementary school age students, where the social detectives essentially are using their ears, eyes, and brains to figure out what others might be thinking or feeling in a certain situation. This also presents the topic of expected and unexpected behaviors. So expected behaviors are things people do or say that others find to be friendly, helpful, respectful, and unexpected behaviors are things people do or say that others find to be mean, hurtful, weird, or disrespectful. So we try using the expected versus unexpected behavior language rather than good or bad behavior. So instead of saying something is good, we would describe it as an expected behavior. And if something that we may in our day-to-day say that's a bad behavior, we really want to change around our language to use the unexpected behavior. Next slide, please. When we think about the idea of being a social detective, or we think about developing theory of mind, both of those concepts are based upon this idea of having a strong emotions vocabulary. Sometimes it can be difficult for children to identify how others might be feeling if they do not have this strong emotions vocabulary. And again, this emotions vocabulary needs to be taken from the implicit, right? So our understanding with it out being described completely, and move it more into this explicit area where we're explicitly teaching what the emotions vocabulary would consist of. Next slide, please. So when we think about, we talked about social thinking, and now what we're going to talk about are interventions for improving social behavior. And we're going to walk through a number of different programs and different examples to be able to help support these areas. Areas that we're going to talk about include the UCLA Peers Program, social stories, comic strip conversations, video modeling, and social skills groups. Now, Nora, in the first part of the presentation, had touched briefly upon social stories, comic strip conversations, as well as video modeling. And what we're going to be able to do is that we're going to take those areas that she briefly touched upon before, and we're really going to break them apart and talk about them more, as well as describing additionally any or other strategies to help support each area. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the UCLA Peers Program, PEERS is really standing for Program for the Education and Enrichment of Relational Skills. Parents can have significant effects upon their child's friendships, both in terms of direct instruction and supervision, as well as supporting their child's development of an appropriate peer network. And so what this program really consists of is 14 90-minute sessions delivered once a week over the course of 14 weeks. Parents and teens attend these sessions at the same time, and they're responsible for assisting the teen with weekly socialization homework assignments and providing social coaching when necessary. In a 2009 study, the use of the program with adolescents was supported to increase the frequency of get-togethers with friends and improved overall social skills when rated on the social skills rating scale. And that is a questionnaire assessing adolescent cooperation, assertion, responsibility, and self-control. Additionally, with this study, the findings were also corroborated in a more recent study and improvements maintained at a 14-week follow-up assessment. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this program a little bit more in depth as well, and then also talk about areas or programs in the area that are close to the Michigan area that are available too. Next slide, please. Breaking down kind of the format of sessions, the UCLA Peers Program, creates like a lesson, and then there are role play exercises, modeling by the group leaders. They talk about the social cognition skills related to that lesson. And then those skills that are explicitly talked about are then rehearsed in session where others are able to provide feedback about how the student was doing within that role-playing exercise. And then the idea is then to take that skill and bring it into the home to be able to repeat and rehearse that same skill. So this program is offered by Creating Brighter Futures in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Typically for this program, they'll complete intakes in November or December, and then the program will typically run from January through May, so about 14 weeks. During the current, during the current pandemic with social distancing guidelines, they were still running the program, but they were utilizing a number of social distancing protocols consisting of didactic lessons, role playing, and as well as also talking about social distancing. Each lesson is followed by role playing exercises in which the group leaders model the appropriate social skill being taught. To improve social cognition, role playing demonstrations are followed by questions such as, what do you think that conversation was like for her? What do you think she thought of me? Do you think she would want to talk to me again? And so these newly learned skills are then rehearsed by the adolescents in session where they receive the feedback, and then again, they go back to be able to practice those parent supervised homework assignments. Next slide. This is just an example of some of the sessions week to week and what that didactic lesson will look like. So for example, for the introduction and trading of information, parents and teens are taught how to trade information during conversations with peers in order to find common interests. And then that homework, being able to take home and practice that skill, can include teens practicing trading information on the phone with a group member. For that second week session, they really focus on the conversational skills and that two-way conversation. And what we're going to do for the next few slides is we're going to talk a little bit more about what those conversational skills look like, and then also provide an example of a way to practice that. Next slide. Thank you. So when we talk about conversational skills, this really consists of reciprocal communication. And so with that, communication is a two-way reciprocal process where we communicate with others to make our needs and desires known, and others communicate back to us to acknowledge and respond to our needs. So within this, initially, we all need to be taught this premise of communication. Children who are able to have this competency of reciprocal communication may engage in a conversation such as Luna asking Miles, do you think the teacher will notice if I eat this cookie? Miles, don't do that, the cookies are for snack time. Luna, but I'm really, really hungry. Miles, will you eat snacks soon? Just ask the teacher. And so what you can see in this example is that this is really providing that reciprocal conversation, that back and forth or exchanging of ideas, and in a sense, turn-taking. And so again, this example is really reflecting that competency in reciprocal communication and the ability to extend that conversation, building on both concrete and abstract concepts and ideas. Next slide. So children and adolescents with autism spectrum disorder may struggle with development of reciprocal communication skills, and practicing conversations can be a great strategy. And so within that, one of the examples that you can do is that when you're practicing conversations, sometimes having a visual aid can be really beneficial. And so what I mean by that is that if you're, say for example, if you have Legos at home, being able to take say, for example, the parent takes the yellow Legos and the student takes the blue Legos. And every time that either individual is talking, they put the Legos into like a box, or it can be a clear container. And so then so every time that information is provided, that person, so either the parent or the student, will put their color Lego into the clear container. At the end of the conversation, then you're able to see who's talking more. Is this really for the student and being able to have that visual feedback? Are there more blue Legos than there are yellow Legos? Are there a lot more yellow Legos than blue Legos? Or is there a good mix within the clear container? And so again, this is really the use of the Lego blocks can provide this visual feedback regarding the conversation and who talked the most or even who talked the least. Next slide, please. And then to pull it back into that UCLA Peers program, in these week's lessons, you can see how these are examples of situations that may not always be regular occurrences. Things such as handling bullying and bad reputations, handling arguments and disagreements, handling rumors and gossip. The purpose for these types of lessons is to address these areas that students may come across and be able to practice the skills that can help them if they're ever put into this type of situation. And so again, what we're doing in these situations is that we're taking the implicit and making it again explicit. So being able to take the ideas and then practice the skills. Next slide, please. Another example that we're going to be talking about that we talked about previously is, or kind of touched upon when we talk about wanting to support social behaviors, is social stories. So this is research by Carroll and Wolf, as well as many others, that have identified social stories as an evidence-based intervention which helps to increase the frequency of the targeted social behaviors. So written stories describe a specific situation, skill, or concept. Some of these can include things like standing in line, personal space, being able to talk about participating in class, and being part of a group. The purpose of the social stories is that they're designed to teach children with autism spectrum disorder how to manage their behavior during a given social situation. They describe where the activity will take place, when it will occur, what will happen, who is participating, and why the child should behave in a given manner. Children working with an adult to address potentially challenging social situations is, again, one of the parts of the purpose. And so, again, what we're doing is we're making the implicit rules explicit and being able to talk about them in greater detail. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a social story, and this one is talking specifically about the rules, in a sense, the explicit rules about standing in line. When we walk to gym or art class, I have to stand in a line. First, I will line up arm's distance away from the person in front of me. I won't get too close to them or be a personal space invader. I will stand still and I won't talk unless my teacher says that I am allowed to. If I do talk, I whisper. When it is time to move, I stay in line and walk quietly with the group, making sure to keep enough space between me and the person in front of me. If I walk in line the way my teacher expects me to, others won't mind standing next to me, and my teacher will be proud of me. So again, when we talk about social stories, I know that when I was reading through this, sometimes in hearing it, it can feel like, well, these are all things that we should know, right? And so that is where that should comes into, of kind of describing those implicit rules, right? Things that are described explicitly in detail, but are thought to be implicitly understood. And so what I encourage everyone to do is that if you ever find that you're using the word should, is to really say, have I taken the time scheduled out the time to really walk the child through exactly what is expected of them and what each of those expectations mean and could be the outcome. And so that is what social stories is really designed to do, is to begin that conversation of how do we, again, not to harp on it, but again, how do we make the implicit explicit? Next slide, please. Another skill or another strategy that we can utilize is comic strip conversations. So these are very similar to social stories, but they use pictures rather than written text. So these are simple figures and other comic strip symbols are drawn by the student or the adult to illustrate a social situation and then allow discussion of the situation, including missed social cues. They help to plan a different outcome for future interactions is the primary goal of this comic strip conversation. Typically use stories taken directly from the child's life and can be used by parents, educators, and therapists. They help children with autism spectrum disorder identify possible missed social cues, and they help to plan for a different outcome in future interactions. Next slide, please. So this comic strip demonstrates interrupting, as well as talking about inappropriate or irrelevant topics. A parent may talk to the child about what they might have said instead, or a better way to enter the conversation. And that would be, for an example, like waiting for the individuals who are already talking to finish talking, being able to use the words "excuse me," or being able to jump in and join the conversation. And so as you can see, hopefully within this slide, I hope the words aren't too small, but what you can see here is that with the thought bubbles, you can see what the student is thinking. So all the kids are talking together and I want to talk with them. And then we see the interruption of I'm wearing Star Wars underpants, and then you're able to see the thought bubbles. And so what happens here is that you're able to see how that interrupting of what others would think based on what the individual joining the conversation would say. And then you're able to talk about, right, with the child of what is something else that they could have done in this situation? What is another way of approaching the situation? And so again, we're just kind of talking about what can we do in each of these examples. And what's really nice about social stories and comic strip conversations is that you can really gear them to whatever the child is currently struggling in, or something that a behavior has come up at that time, and you're really wanting to have different strategies to be able to talk about that situation and about other options and other things that could have happened in that situation. So again, it can be a really nice way of almost processing through the situation that had occurred previously too. Next slide. Thank you. So video modeling. So this is an evidence-based research suggests that video modeling can be effectively implemented with learners from early childhood through middle school. In the studies that serve as the foundation for the evidence base, video modeling was implemented in home and school settings. And there are different types of video modeling. But kind of primary purpose for video modeling is peers or adults can make videos to model appropriate behavior for greetings, entering a conversation, apologizing to a friend, or how to participate in those reciprocal conversations with others. And as the slide suggests, there are several different types of the video modeling. With the basic video modeling, this really involves recording someone besides the learner engaging in the target behavior or skill. So, or for example, modeling what that behavior should look like. The video is then viewed by the learner at a later time. There's also video self-modeling, and this is used to record the learner displaying the target skill or behavior, and then again is reviewed later. Further, there's point of view video self-modeling is when, or point of view video modeling is when the target behavior or skill is recorded from the perspective of the learner. And then there's video prompting, and video prompting involves breaking the behavior or skill into steps and recording each step with incorporated pauses during which the learner may attempt the view before viewing subsequent steps. And so in a sense, the video prompting is kind of a visual representation of social stories. Because if you remember when we were back on the social stories, and Nora, if you don't mind, could we jump back to that slide? Would that be okay, the social stories example? So just to kind of give a reference, with social stories, this is a verbal way of being able to explain the steps of what we would expect in a given situation. And then if we jump back down into video modeling, thank you, Nora. If we jump back into video modeling, the video prompting is a visual way of being able to see each of those steps. And video prompting, though, takes it to a next step. In a sense, I guess you could say actually all of the video modeling models would be a way of being able to see those steps in a visual format versus a written format or a verbal format. But video prompting, what's nice or what is beneficial about that is that you can record one step like it describes, take that pause and allow the learner to say or be able to question the learner of what do you think is going to happen next, or what would we want to do next in this situation before continuing on into the next steps of the video. And why, when we think about video modeling, why do we see this as really being an effective or an evidence-based research strategy? So many individuals with autism spectrum disorder, you know, as we know, really love screen time. And that's not just children with autism spectrum disorder, I would say, and argue that that might be all children, especially during this time. Really focus on that screen time. And they have an easier time attending to videos than in real life situations. What's really also beneficial about it is that you can edit out and simplify situations in videos to avoid common distractions in real life environments. For an individual with autism spectrum disorder, the sensory problems may make the real world environment sometimes too overstimulating. And so the video modeling helps to tailor and to focus on solely the skill with being able to filter out those other distractions or other environment stimuli. Additionally, what's very positive is the biggest difference between video modeling versus real life is that videos we can rewind and we can repeat and we can practice. And so this allows the individual to be able to watch it multiple times and be able to learn from it, and again, be able to practice that skill. Additionally, videos can echo real life more than pictures, so they actually show how to do something, and this is something that we all use. And so, for example, what I mean by that is that has anyone ever taken a cooking show? Right? Or been able to follow like a YouTube video about how to complete a certain task. Those are all examples of video modeling and how we're able to learn by watching someone else complete a task. Right, very good. And next slide, please. Thank you. Additionally, one of the other areas that we're going to touch upon, and I just wanted to talk about, was also social skills groups. And these are evidence-based interventions for school-age children with autism spectrum disorder. The UCLA programs would be an example of a social skills group. However, when we think about most social skills group and how UCLA Peers program differs is that UCLA Peers program uses and follows a manualized weekly schedule versus most social skills groups will focus maybe on a topic that other participants or other families have brought up about wanting to be the topic for the day or the topic for that week. Versus again, UCLA Peers program really uses this guideline that then can be repeated in other area or other programs as well, or by others. Social skills group help children practice social skills with same age peers, and ideally the supervision and feedback is provided to children in the groups. Next slide, please. So we wanted to just touch upon kind of the effects from the entire year. So during this unprecedented year, many interventions have been interrupted, discontinued, or adjusted to follow social distancing guidelines. Nora and I wanted to highlight that many of the strategies we have discussed today have the ability to be implemented within the home environment, including things that we just talked about, including the social stories, the video modeling, comic strip conversations, and then even the feedback or that Lego feedback that we talked about previously as well. Nora had also discussed about the pivotal reaction therapy of parent-focused evidence-based behavior management therapy based on ABA principles. And that was initially designed for families on a wait list for ABA and therapy services. And so again, that is a way of being able to continue providing these strategies even within the current pandemic. Our hope is that the strategies and resources we have provided today will support your children and families moving forward. Next slide.
Okay, so here at kind of the end of our presentation, we wanted to make sure that we provided you guys with some resources and some programs, certainly within kind of the Detroit area, but also kind of more wide-reaching as well. So of course, the Autism Alliance of Michigan, we've put their website here in this slide, but they've got excellent resources for social skills programming, as well as social skills groups in your area. And I know we got that 2-minute intro about kind of some services and things like that. But we certainly wanted to kind of draw your attention to the Autism Alliance of Michigan. Another organization that we find to be helpful is Autism Speaks, which is a national organization, but they do have this autism response team, or the ART team at Autism Speaks. And so you can give them a phone call or you can reach them through their website. And what the ART does is they can help you provide, it's individuals who can connect you with certain resources in your area. So you'll get to speak to somebody and they can help you, tell you where you could get an evaluation or provide resources about schools and special education. They also provide advocacy and other kinds of support for the family, as well as community activities, adult services like employment programs and things like that. So it's really supposed to be kind of a well-rounded kind of wraparound service where they can connect you with services in your area. Here is the website for the UCLA Peers program that Dr. Gindlesperger talked about. She mentioned they are doing kind of in-person training. They're also currently doing some telehealth services, particularly for peers. So if that's an issue in terms of location, or certainly for social distancing concerns, they do have some options there. We've also provided some books that can be really helpful, and these are focused on things like those social stories that Dr. Gindlesperger talked about, and other kinds of, interventions and ways to kind of talk about social skills. Okay, and then there we go. Some other resources that we wanted to provide you are kind of some behavioral therapy resources. Now, all of these here included, so Henry Ford, as well as these local university clinics, while it is kind of a general behavioral therapy clinic, they also provide social skills interventions. So we wanted to draw your attention to these organizations in case you were interested in kind of following up and seeing what services they provide. Okay, and then we've got some of our references that we kind of referred to today.
Perfect. Thank you both for your time. We are going to end this webinar. If you have additional questions for the speakers, their contact information is up on the slide here, and then we'll have a break for about 30 minutes, and the next breakout sessions will start at 12:15.